Welcome back, everybody. It's now 11:30 Melbourne time, and we're having our second session for the day, which is looking at rethinking human relationships with Antarctica with Priscilla Wehi, and I'm assuming I'm saying that correct, and I hope I'm saying it correct. And Scylla's also got, I believe you're going to have a colleague as well joining you in this. That's Billy van Uitregt. And I can't see if he's here yet, Scylla, so
No, that's okay. He won't be coming till around 2. He's in the middle of teaching at the moment.
Oh, okay, that's fine. That's great. Okay. We were really keen to hear from Scylla and her team because they've recently published an utterly fascinating article looking at Māori oral traditions associated with long voyages towards the Southern Ocean and into, indeed, Antarctica, or at least the Antarctic Circle. So just thrilled, absolutely thrilled, Scylla, that you could join us today. So thank you and welcome. I believe you're going to you've got an idea, you've got a 40-minute presentation with the 20 minutes of discussion. So again, I ask everybody, please pop your questions or your ideas in the chat. I think that would be a really useful way for us to continue the conversation. I will do my best to read them out where I can. Some of them escaped me in the last session, I have to admit. There was quite a lot, so I apologise in advance for that. So Scylla, would you like to start?
Okay. Kia ora tātou. So he mihi nui ki a koutou kua whakarongo mai nei. Ko Scylla Wehi tōku ingoa. Ka noho hau I runa I ngā whenua o Ngaitahu I te Waipounamu o Aotearoa nei. Engari ka mihi hoki a hau ki a Waikato ki a tūhoi na iwi kua whāngai mai. A ki Oku ake tipuna no Kotirana. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure and I really look forward to engaging in conversation with you. I just wanted to begin by acknowledging all of us as we speak and engage together on the lands of all of the traditional peoples where we are. So for me, I'm down in the South Island of New Zealand, which is where Ngaitahu, Ngāti Mamoi and Waitaha are the stewards, traditional stewards, and just acknowledging the peoples from where I come and those who have been a really important part of my journey as well. So I'm going to talk to you on behalf of our team. We have a very big team of people. Which also includes many in the community, and you'll see some of these community members in this talk. We're incredibly lucky to partner in this research with Ngāti Wai in the north and Ngai Tahu in the south of our country. And their voices and their work has been incredibly important in shaping the research and in doing the work that we have done and continue to do. So my other colleague, Billy van Uitregt, will come shortly. And I hope that we'll be able to create some dialogue with him in the question time. So, which is why I'm kind of doing a slightly shorter presentation in the hope that we'll be able to really have some great discussion later on. So Billy, actually, just for those of you, when you do meet him, he grew up in Australia but as what we call a Mozzie, which is a Māori, someone from New Zealand, growing up in Australia. So he's very much got different feet in both Australia and in Aotearoa New Zealand. And that brings its own perspectives and joys as well. So I'm just going to do a short presentation now about our Antarctic work. And so to do that, I am going to share my screen. And take you here. So what we've done is over the last few years, we've done this work we've really started thinking about how we can transform Antarctic research and management by including Māori perspectives. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit first about Māori knowledge systems. So some of you might be more familiar with this kind of idea. Perhaps you've engaged with some of the traditional owners in Australia or in other parts of the world. But a lot of this really is about thinking what the foundation of a knowledge system looks like. And so in starting this research program, the idea of what is mātauranga and what does it look like was really important. So this word that we use, mātauranga, really refers to a knowledge system. It's not just knowledge in isolation in an unconnected way. And there are three really important concepts that I'm going to talk about in relation to this work. So the first of these is what we call kaitiakitanga. So we often translate this as stewardship, but really it's a concept that bundles up lots of other concepts within it. And some of these include whakapapa and manaakitanga. So whakapapa here, you know, people often translate this as genealogy. It's this idea of relationship of descent. So our whakapapa is about the parents that we have, the peoples that we descend from. That's how we often might think of it. But actually it's a great deal more than that, because whakapapa connects humans and other living things. So a whakapapa is not just a human construct. Whakapapa means that as humans, we are in relationship, we are relations of other living things. It also means that we're in relationship with non-living things as well. So this is a foundation of connectedness. We can think of it as a web. So it's not a linear descent line, it's much more a web. The other concept that's really important here is manaakitanga. And you know, if you live in New Zealand, people often think of it as hospitality. So you might go and visit somebody and then they would provide for you. But actually that's not quite it. So for manaakitanga, when we talk about that, what we really mean is that there's both a reciprocity. So it's I look after you and you look after me. It's a collective concept, but also there are responsibilities embedded within it. So in the way that we act and the things that we do. So it's both reciprocity and responsibility with a very collective framing around those things. So if these are the underlying concepts that we're working with in terms of thinking about Māori perspectives in relation to environmental management or conservation, then what do Māori values and stories say about human relationships with the world? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to briefly touch on, give you some examples from Aotearoa, from New Zealand, before we go to Antarctica. And so first up, just to recap on Indigenous knowledge. So this is in a way the English version of mātauranga. So just to remind you that this is a system of understanding your environment. It's got a very intergenerational aspect to it. Observations and experience are a really critical part of that, and I'm going to come back to that. And people literally stake their lives on it. So if you think about medicinal knowledge, for example, it really is something that matters, that you get it right, that you recognize the plants, that you know their uses, for example. So it's cumulative, it builds from one generation to the next. Transgenerational, dynamic, so doesn't stay the same through time. It's open to discovery and change, holistic and collectively held. And I think all of these things are important when we get to talking about Antarctica. So remembering that it's dynamic, you know, that means that it can change with the different circumstances that we see coming, whether it's climate change or environmental protection in Antarctica or ice sheet melting, whatever. So here I just want to remind you again of this sense that knowledge does not stand in isolation. So it's intimately connected to the way that we practice, the harvesting that we do, the actions that we take. And that again, the values and beliefs that we hold are really foundational as well in terms of the knowledge, the questions that we choose to ask and answer even. They're all driven by our values, our beliefs, and also the values and beliefs are connected to the practices that we undertake. So this is very intertwined. So I'm just going to give you an example now from Aotearoa, where you can see something about this idea. So this is related to a story from my husband's place, which is on the west coast of New Zealand. So this is a very small rural community where my mother-in-law grew up actually. And in the background, you can see Karioi, the mountain, which is the mountain that the people here associate with. And the marae, which is Ōkapu. So this is a traditional meeting place. And if you look really carefully, you can probably see there are drawings on the doors. So those drawings are actually spiritual beings, if you like. They're taniwha that belong to stories about the sea, the harbour that you see there behind the marae. So they are the guardians of this particular harbour and inform the way that people fish. So fishing is one of the core activities here. And all of these ideas are actually encapsulated in oral tradition. And I say oral because Māori are a people where oral tradition is one of the ways where knowledge is transmitted. So there wasn't a written language before European arrival in the 19th century, early 19th century. And so oral tradition was incredibly important. Stories were important as a way of passing on both values and knowledge. And so here, the ancestral saying, if you like, is kawhia moana, kawhia kai, kawhia tangata, Aotea whenua. So kawhia is actually the place just next to Aotea Harbour here. And the moana refers to the sea, the kai to all of the fishing and important foods that come from looking after the sea. The tangata are the people who both sustain and are sustained by those foods. And Aotea whenua refers to the land, so the very rich resources, the forest, the birds and so on that are on the land next to the sea. So this is an example of how we can start understanding the values and the ways that things connect together. So this goes back to a woman. I'm just going to give you one more example of a story here that embeds some of these ideas around kaitiakitanga, around stewardship, around manaakitanga, which is reciprocity and what we're able to give, and also resilience. So Whakaotirangi is this woman that you see in the carving, and she was a woman a very special woman who came on the Tainui canoe from Hawaii and arrived in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So she was one of the most famous ancestors for this particular area that I'm talking about. So at Kawhia, around that area. And so she's so famous, she's still spoken about on marae around the country, for example. And if you look closely, you can see she's holding a kete, so a basket. And again, she's remembered in oral tradition when people talk about te kete roki roki a whakaotirangi. So this is the seed basket, the basket with seed kumara of whakaotirangi. So when Māori came to New Zealand, traveling through the Pacific from Hawaii, which is a tropical place. So everything, all of the plants that came with them were tropical plants. So kumara is a tropical plant. And yet she arrived here in a very temperate environment, very cool, quite different. And so her challenge was to plant these seed kumara. So she experimented with the soils, the growing conditions. She ended up planting a magnificent garden between the two harbours, between Aotea and Kawhia harbours, very close to where I took that picture. that photo. And she had a huge garden called Hawaii Nui. And the name of that garden actually reflects the expansiveness of the gardens that she was able to grow in that place to feed her people. So in other words, she, all of her work supported the survival and the flourishing of Tainui people. So this is why she's incredibly important. But, you know, by looking after the land, then in turn the land was able to produce all of the kumara and the other plants sustained the people. So manaakitanga is really at the center of this story. So as we go on, we can think again about these ideas that are often very tied to place. So I've told you stories about a particular place, Kawhia, and yet when we turn to somewhere like Antarctica, where there are no indigenous peoples or peoples of any kind that live there, you know, we can ask, well, what value do we have in bringing Māori perspectives? What can we do there that might be relevant? And so I think here we need to go back to that foundation and all of those foundational concepts around manaakitanga, about reciprocity, about what are our responsibilities and how are we connected to place, to that place. And we need to think more about what does it mean to relate well. So this is at the heart of our work, this idea, thinking about relationships, about what does it mean to be a kaitiaki, a really good steward in relation to Antarctica, and how might that change how we think about Antarctic management or the conservation or protection of the ecosystems there. So to do that, I'm going to talk about a project called Te Whakairo. And so we began a research, so you'll know that, or you may know that the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area came into being in December 2017 in Antarctica. So this was the first marine protected area there, and to date, it's actually the only one. So it came about through the consensus decision making in the Antarctic Treaty System. So 2017, so one of the conditions of that marine protected area is that we monitor it and evaluate how well it's doing, because after 30 years, there has to be another decision to decide whether it continues or not. So it's a finite length of time. So you can see that monitoring it and thinking about its management is an incredibly important thing to do as we travel along this pathway. So I was asked to lead what we call the vision mātauranga part of that research in terms of the monitoring and evaluating its effectiveness. And what we decided to do in this vision mātauranga research strand, this strand that really was drawing from and celebrating Māori knowledges and perspectives, we decided that rather than start with research that we might write about, that we would actually create carving. So you can see from Whakaotirangi, who I showed you earlier, that carving is actually not what we call art. So the master carvers involved in this project would absolutely shudder if I called their carving art. They see carving as a repository of knowledge. So this is one of the ways that knowledge is held within Māori society. So to be a master carver is actually to know a great deal about history, about story, about karakia, so incantations, to know the history of different peoples and understand how they're connected, as well as knowing about all the foundational concepts within that Māori knowledge system of mātauranga. So we said, okay, well, Whakairo is a really good place to start if we're doing research about Antarctica within a mātauranga paradigm. So we wanted to change the paradigm here. And so there are a number of carvers involved. Two of them here are James York on the left and Potama Hetaraka on the right. And they were the two carvers in our team who actually went to Antarctica to complete this carving. So we did a lot of the work here in New Zealand, but to finish it, they went to Antarctica and they put up this carving around a doorway. And just, you know, we were lucky. We were working with Antarctica New Zealand on this. They were incredibly supportive. And, you know, if you look at that doorway, it looks like, maybe it looks like any old door. But for us, this is important because this is actually the door that goes into Scott Base, which is New Zealand's base in Antarctica. So every person in the New Zealand Antarctic program passes through this door. So in other words, what we do here, what we surround this door with and what people walk through is important in terms of how we go on. So I'm going to come back to the whakairo, which we worked on as a project in 2018 and 2019. But I just want to go back to the sense of a timeline, because this is a very European idea, really, about history, I guess, very linear. But what I want to show you are some of the bits that we've added into this timeline of Antarctic history. So when we started thinking about the whakairo, we also started thinking about the narratives that Māori hold around Antarctica, and there are a number held by a number of different tribal groups, and also through the Pacific as well. So the first of these stories is around an explorer called Uitregt, who voyaged south, and there are stories about that he encountered these sheets of ice. Well, we think it's ice, so there's some debate about what those words mean. And there's another explorer, Tamarereti, who's there's a carving of him down at Bluff, which is the southernmost point of New Zealand. He went south searching for the Aurora Australis. He didn't come back, and this is one of the things in stories. Not everybody comes back, not everybody is successful, but nevertheless, there is a story, a narrative about his search for the origins of the Aurora. So his ocean-going vessel, his what we call a waka, was wrecked. So these stories are actually embedded in the constellations at night. And so you can imagine that for people who voyage across the Pacific, that this is really important. So I'll just, if you think about Polynesian settlement, the Polynesians are very accomplished, incredible voyagers who have moved right across much of the Pacific. So these are people who can really read the winds, read the skies, who look at the bird life when they're thinking about whether there are landforms present, for example. So consummate voyagers, and you can see in the middle there, Aotearoa New Zealand is the last stop, if you like. This is remote Oceania. But you can probably also imagine that for voyagers who are that good, that naturally they might want to also voyage further south to see what was there. So we know that there are archaeological remains in some of the sub-Antarctic islands. On others there are not, but nevertheless it points to the fact that there was voyaging going south. So the archaeology plus the narratives of the oral tradition suggest that there were people voyaging in the Southern Oceans and towards the Antarctic Circle. So we don't know the details of that, in the sense we don't know at the moment whether people made landfall. We don't know whether they reached the Antarctic Circle or what date exactly that was. But nevertheless, what we do see is that there's a strong feeling of connection. I think when people tell stories, it tells you about the relationships that they hold dear. It tells you about their desire for discovery, which is, you know, perhaps universal in most cultures. So there are some very exciting things that the narratives can tell us just in and of themselves. But I want to move on a bit further now, because there's a whole history of 19th century and early 20th century exploration in Antarctica. And interestingly enough, Māori are also part of those voyages too. So what we might call imperialist voyages, and that heroic age of discovery, which really centers European European movements, if you like. And so what we see is for example, this map from 1840. This is from Charles Wilkes's map. So he led an expedition between 1838 and 1842. And these were the people who viewed the coast of Antarctica. And there was a Māori man called Tuati on board that voyage. So because of the immense seafaring skill of Māori, ships that came to New Zealand often picked up Māori or New Zealanders who had this kind of expertise in the Southern Ocean. So Tuati was one of those. But there were many others as well. You can see the man here depicted here is actually a doctor. So this is a man called Louis Portaka from the Whanganui River. So in 1934, he was on another expedition on the Bear of Oakland that went to Antarctica for over a year. So as ship's doctor, he got to do emergency appendectomies and other things like that before returning to New Zealand. So you can see that there's a continuation of this Māori exploration and this Māori desire to see what else there is beyond New Zealand. So quite exciting. And I'm just going to briefly mention Scott's expeditions here. So this is the Terra Nova expedition. And I think that even just the name that we call it, the Terra Nova, you know, the new land, this tells you about, it tells all of us about how for the British and many other peoples, this expansion into the unknown, this discovery, it was very tied up with territorial claims, for example. Now, one of the interesting things I just want to point out, because I think it's really interesting, you can see the ponies that Scott used in this picture. So there was a bit of a discussion, you know, with the failure of his expedition to the South Pole, whether perhaps if he'd used huskies, whether it might have been more successful. But, you know, after the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, the purpose of people going to Antarctica shifted to being peace and science. But nevertheless, science was still put into the use, I guess, of this sort of discovery and expansion kind of program. So the huskies here are from around 1960. They were taken by someone in my family. These were his husky dogs that he looked after on these trips as they explored the Larsen ice shelf, actually. And now, of course, we don't have huskies. But, you know, so after the Antarctic treaties, the treaty was signed in 59, peace and science, what we find then is that in New Zealand, for example, there's a big shift towards ecosystem science. So understanding these networks, these processes, how species interrelate within the Ross Sea, because that's our primary area of influence, I guess, in Antarctica. That's where Scott bases. And so just to show you, this is the work that many New Zealand scientists still do, investigating and trying to understand these processes in relation to the ice shelf and the other conditions within Antarctica. But I want to move a lot further now. So that was 1959. So at that time, there was really, although there were Māori visiting Antarctica, exploring Antarctica as part of these expeditions, there was very little of what we might call mātauranga incorporated into those expeditions in the 19th and 20th century. So when we think about, well, how might those fit with mātauranga? When do we start to see mātauranga? So not just Māori as part of other things, but Māori actually expressing ideas and concepts that, or perspectives that might really come from a different cultural base. And that really didn't start happening. Well, it started happening a little bit in the 1960s, but probably one of the really cool examples is from 2012. And this is a traditional Māori art form, tuku tuku, so it's a form of weaving, if you like. And these panels were made by some Ngāti Waewae weavers in New Zealand, but also made with Scott Base staff. So again, they went to Scott Base to complete this work. And the top panel is what we call He Maumahara, which is the stars shining in the night sky. And one of the purposes here actually is to remember all of those who've died in Antarctica or in its service. So in New Zealand, we have, in 1979, there was actually a huge airplane crash in Antarctica, which killed 257 passengers and crew. So this is part of our linking back to that event, but also to all others and remembering their contribution. So this is also a really important part of cultural thinking, that we link the past and the future. The second panel is one that's often called Potama, which is a stairway to knowledge. So that one, the second one, He Manukura, is really about the ongoing journey of learning that we have in Antarctic research. But you see this on marae around the country because knowledge is very deeply valued. So now I'm going to go back to Te Whakairo, back to this carving. So, you know, why might this be important? So I've said we really wanted to start within a different kind of knowledge paradigm to really bring Māori perspectives, to think about kaitiakitanga, that stewardship, and customary practices and philosophies. So all of those things being important. So when we met over the year before this was actually carved, we were thinking about what were the ideas, the concepts, the stories that were really important that we wanted to put into this whakairo. And drawing on the maramataka, which is, if you like, the natural rhythm of the world to guide environmental thinking. So, whakairo, as I've said, this is a traditional Māori carved form that embodies and acts as a repository of knowledge. So that's how we see it, and that's why we began our research project in this way. So to think about the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area and its future management. So this is very much a partnership with the community, with Ngāti Wai and Ngaitahu. And so we were really working together to weave this particular project. It's pretty cool. So these are the questions that we were going back to. Again, these concepts of manaakitanga, of whakapapa, and thinking about how Antarctic management now might connect with those ideas. And this is, I'll just give you some small examples of how the carvers connected with those ideas and how they put them in the carving. So here, James is actually carving. So what they did was, we started in New Zealand, but for the last couple of weeks to finish this, we shipped it to Antarctica, down to Ross Base, Scott Base, and James and Potama spent some time there talking to the scientists working there, but also walking around so that they could connect with the environment. So one of the things that we hear in Aotearoa is we hear people say things like, I'm the river and the river is me. So ko au te awa, ko te awa ko au. And I think, you know, these kinds of ideas are really important. So here, James is actually, he was connecting with some of the ecosystem scientists, and he realized that in ecology, these ideas about connection and networks really spoke to him in this traditional pattern here, which is called Te Punga Weri Weri Whakare. So this is a recurring theme in the parts that he's carved, where he's saying repeatedly, everything is connected. So this goes back to these ideas of relationship and whakapapa. And so wherever he's carving, we see these particular patterns. Potama did this really interesting thing where he went out, one of the things he noticed was the pressure ridges that you can see on the ice there. And he incorporated these into his carving in one of the posts. So you can see them quite clearly on the left. So this is part of what we think about as practice. So you can have knowledge, but without the practice, without being there, without connecting to place, the knowledge sits alone. So here what Potama is doing is he's speaking in his carving about the connectedness of people in the land or people in the ice. So this is about kaitiakitanga stewardship, and again that I'm the river and the river is me. I'm in Antarctica and Antarctica is in the carving. So he's embedding it within the carving. And finally, this is the last detailed bit really. This is what we call te kupinga. And if you look at it carefully, it might look a bit like a net to you if you hold your head sideways. So when we think about the Ross Sea, one of the main activities there is fishing, and in particular toothfish fishing. And it's critical that we try and get the catch limits right, and that there isn't a big bycatch, for example. So there's a lot of work that scientists do about sustainability in terms of making sure that toothfish are not overfished in the Ross Sea. So there's been a bit of work done on this. So one of our collaborators and co-authors, Nigel Scott, did a lot of thinking about fishing from a Ngāi Tahu perspective. And when we talk about the net, it's about the spacing of the net, so of the hole, so that you only take what you need. So this is a really critical concept. So it's about filling the net with what you need, but not more. And if you think about, for example, the size of fish and how important that is in modern fishing, you can see that the size of the holes and the nets themselves, that those are really important in how we make the net. But this also speaks to the intergenerationality, because the critical bit here is that there's enough for the future, that we're not taking everything and that we're leaving enough for the generations yet to come. So these ideas of reciprocity and sustainability and also intergenerational thinking are all embedded within this kupinga pattern that he's carving. And so this finally is the bit on top of the door, which James carved. And this speaks actually to the partnership both between scientists and Indigenous peoples. So in those creatures you see on the left and on the right, but also the partnership between Ngāti Wai and Ngāi Tahu. So they're really saying that this partnership is how we can find some shared values and the impetus to work together. But he's also incorporated some other really cool ideas in here. If you look in the center, he's got the moon. And there's a rather twisted looking creature there. So that twisted creature is really challenging us by saying things have gone wrong. The natural cycles that we know now have changed from what they were, and things have gone awry. So the challenge is that we need to fix this. And there's some other bits as well. So you can see the different moon faces, for example, that he's embedded around the moon itself. There's some other things in there too, but that's just a bit of an overview. And all of this speaks to this idea of mātauranga, of a knowledge system having both values embedded within it, that it's also about the process of how we do things and the practice. So here what you can see is James and Potama down in Antarctica and Scott Base, and they're actually talking to people about what they do. They're sharing that knowledge so that it's transmitted as well through scientists, through others at Scott Base and back out to the New Zealand community more widely. And so that really comes down to this idea of, you know, why would we partner? Why as a scientist would I partner with Indigenous peoples, with Māori communities? You know, and I think there's a lot of ways that we can understand this. So, for example, within New Zealand, we have the Treaty of Waitangi, which is one of the constitutional foundations here. So it was signed in 1840 and really did create this partnership. And there are lots of ideas embedded in it around equality, but also what we call tino rangatiratanga, which is what we often translate as self-determination. So it's, I think, you know, when we think about the treaty, as well as many other things about equity, if we're to think about Antarctica, if the ice shelf melts, who are the people who are most affected by that, most impacted? You know, it's not an equitable thing. So the people who are most impacted by what happens in Antarctica are often people who have no voice within the Antarctic Treaty System. And so when we partner, we're partnering so that there is a greater equity in what we do, but also because the concepts are incredibly valuable if we are to find the best solutions in terms of protection, both now and in the future. So a whole lot of reasons, and I'm sure, you know, for people in Australia, there are many, many reasons why as researchers you might partner with Indigenous Australians and with other groups in the community as well. So the question then is, where do we go now? So we have an Antarctic treaty system, but it's not always easy to protect Antarctic, the continent or the waters around it through the current mechanisms. So I'm just going to throw something a bit new out there at you and talk about legal personhood. So this is a really interesting concept that's been in play over the last sort of 10, 15 years. And there are examples around the world of rivers, for example, in Colombia, India, and also here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and other places, where rivers now have legal personhood. And this is an example of a forest, which is now co-managed by the Indigenous peoples who live within it and whose territory it is, and representatives of the Crown. And even the start of this act is incredibly beautiful because, you know, when people wrote it, Tuhoi, the people who live here, they wanted the expression of Te Urawera and its importance and who it is. So if we go back to this idea of whakapapa, of their relation, to be really expressed in this act. And so you can see when you read the background that it's ancient and enduring, a fortress of nature, alive with history. It's a place of spiritual value with its own mana and mauri, so its own essence, its own prestige. It has an identity in and of itself. So this is a really interesting concept, I think. And here's a picture of Te Urawera itself. And this is one, just to finish, that we've taken up and we're now proposing that perhaps this might be a useful way of protecting the Antarctic in future. So if we think about all of those Indigenous concepts, so Māori concepts that I've talked about, and perhaps similar concepts held by other Indigenous peoples, these are concepts that we can put in something like an Antarctic Declaration, which is really by people who might be invisible within the Antarctic Treaty System. So here we can create a much more inclusive approach to Antarctic management, a collaborative approach and collective approach to Antarctic management by taking, you know, those examples of legal personhood and saying, well, so what would it look like if we did that with the Antarctica? If we brought those ideas of collective responsibility, of reciprocity, of stewardship, of kaitiakitanga to Antarctica, what would it look like? And so just to finish, I'd really encourage you to go to this website because this is a live document where you can give your feedback and create change in the document. Because that's what we want at the moment. We want people to read it and to add in things that we've missed, to allow everyone to have a voice, to see if we can create a mechanism for Antarctica to be protected in a way that really resonates much more strongly with Indigenous perspectives and is much more inclusive in its framing. So, so that's all that I'm going to say. But I really welcome your questions and comments, and yeah, I hope that I can answer them actually. So kia ora tātou.
Thank you, Scylla. We're just a couple of little technical issues. Okay, we've got Billy and we're just about
to
great. Spotlight him.
All right. Well, should I introduce Billy then? So Billy is
that would be
so one of the absolute stalwarts in this work, one of the very important people who has been working on how to increase Indigenous participation in Antarctic policy, and has been a really big part of our team. So Billy, do you want to just introduce yourself quickly?
Kia ora koutou. An Australian-born Māori, and I whakapapa to Taranaki, Wanganui and Tūhoe. I guess my background is working with First Nations in Aussie on water policy in the Murray-Darling Basin. And that's, I see this sort of mahi, this work or research as an extension of that sort of, the political negotiation of building an Indigenous voice across these really geopolitically complex, multi-jurisdictional regions is really tough to do. So taking lessons from other places where Indigenous peoples have already negotiated their voice in a really strong way, I think will be really fundamental for where this work goes next. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you so much. What a fabulous presentation. Such fascinating work. I've learned so much, not least of which I learned there's a new word, mozzie. I'd never heard of a mozzie before. So I'm a Maori born in Australia. Fantastic. We've had a couple of comments here in the chat, and I think I might just get back to them. Margarita Stevens noted just how compelling this was, but also just, of course, I'm sorry, it's all just, it's a bit hard to see. It's compelling and a wonderful practice to counter the short-sighted rapaciousness of capitalism. Couldn't agree more. Ian McNiven has asked an interesting question here, and I don't know if you have given it any thought, but he's saying if modern carvings embed Antarctic experience, is it possible for contemporary master carvers to examine old carvings looking for Antarctic symbols or imagery?
I think that's such a fantastic question, to be honest. I hadn't really thought about it like that. And I wish that one of our master carvers were here to answer that. I guess not all carvings that I know of in New Zealand are contemporary though. So if you go into a meeting house, for example, some of our meeting houses might be 100 years old or more, 120, or I don't even know how old the oldest meeting house is. So some carvings are relatively old. And there are depictions of, for example, Huite Rangiora at different marae around the country. So he does appear, again, because I think with important figures like that, this is one of the ways that their stories are remembered and embedded. So not all of the carvings that we see of people like Tamarereti are modern. They do go back quite some time, and particularly with Huite Rangiora. But I don't know of older carvings. I think that kind of knowledge would probably fall under a master carver. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
It's a wonderful question, though.
It is. It's got my mind racing, because I think that would be just such an interesting thing to see, a master carver. I mean, I'm thinking of somebody, really knowledgeable, like, is it Cliff Whiting or one of those who really knows the ins and outs of carving? Yeah. Okay. A lot of comments here saying thank you for the amazing work, because this truly is remarkable work. But Marguerite Stevens has asked a question which I had percolating in my mind as well. Was there any resistance to embedding this knowledge and practice into the Aotearoa and Antarctic program? I mean, did you get any pushback?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a great question. I mean, I can talk a little bit, and then I'd be interested to see what Billy thinks. So Billy's had a lot to do, worked with MFAT a lot, so our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who actually are in charge of Antarctic policy. So when we started with Whakairo, absolutely, it was a bit of a shock, especially to our scientist colleagues. when we said actually we want to not just begin with whakaaro, but to resource it, to resource our master carvers as researchers. That was a bit of a shock, and they had to go back to government to get permission to do that. So it was surprising. Having said that, once we began, I think they realised fairly quickly how special it was to actually have such expertise on board, and to have some of those really creative interdisciplinary conversations that had not been a feature of New Zealand Antarctic science up till now. So I think once they kind of started to get it, I mean, I'm sure there are probably some mutterings in the corner somewhere, you know, but nevertheless, a lot of people got on board. And when the carvers went down, my gosh, they were such a hit. Just, I think, for people working there to see the intentionality of the work, and to have these really amazing conversations about different perspectives and where these concepts aligned with what scientists were doing. Very exciting. But Billy, do you want to talk a bit about some of the other spaces you've been working in?
Yeah, so quite explicitly on New Zealand's Antarctic research priorities and directions strategy document. So it's like the national level document that guides what Antarctic research New Zealand will engage with for the next 10 years. We've had some, I wouldn't say struggles, you know, it was totally silent on it before now. They're going through this refresh process, and there's some kind of basic things you can do to recognise. So recognising the value of Mātauranga Māori in particular first, and committing to some sort of partnership arrangements with hapu and iwi. And they've done that in a few things. Now it's translated into the research strategy document. But probably the big thing I'll kind of leave you with is, and I think stimulated by Scylla's work in no small sense, so the Antarctic kaupapa, or the Antarctic narratives, are always defined by science. So for lots of people, science doesn't include Mātauranga Māori or Indigenous knowledges in general. So we've pushed really hard at a few key points, and what we've seen in the last draft that we saw, they kind of opened it up to Antarctic research. So it's not Antarctic science, it's Antarctic research, making way for not only the social sciences and humanities, but also for Indigenous knowledges and practices to come to the fore. So that's I think we take that as the big win, and it's the best thing we could have hoped for in this round. Yeah,
It's
and we'll
fantastic.
keep pushing next time.
I can imagine people having thought that the inclusion of Māori knowledges and Māori narratives would be a form of sort of, you know, inserting some politics into, you know, into what they see as their science. But of course, its absence is also very political.
Yes.
So
Well, exactly. Well, you know, in a sense, I think Antarctic science is where you really see how political science is. Got nations are arguing over science basically because of political premises. So I think Antarctica is great for so many things. It just challenges the way we think about things.
Excellent, excellent. Do we have any more questions? I'm not seeing, and nobody's putting their hand up. So please do, if you have anything you'd like to ask of this absolutely fascinating work.
I was actually going to say, just going on from what Billy was saying, I can't remember what I was going to say now. Oh, that's bad. I've just lost my thought.
It happens to the best of us.
Yeah.
When I first goes, please, Scylla.
Oh, well, yeah, no, I was going to talk about how we stretch concepts. So that's been one of the fascinating things for us, is that we start with ideas like kaitiakitanga, which is very tied to place. So the relationship between people and place. So then we've ended up saying, well, so given that Antarctica doesn't have any Indigenous peoples or people of any kind living there, how do these traditional concepts stretch? So this goes back to the dynamic nature of Indigenous knowledge and thinking about where the boundaries of different concepts are. So you can get into some really interesting philosophical spaces around stretching different concepts. So we've been doing some thinking about that, and yeah, really good for the brain to, and I think, you know, we can think about that in relation to, you know, Russia or China or other countries that are fishing. You know, they're fishing a long way from home. So how do we, so they're willing to actually go a long way from home, but what do we do with the concepts? Do the concepts travel as well? and which concepts travel most strongly, and how do we make most visible the ones that are important for sustainability? So there's some really interesting questions, I think, in that space. Yeah.
Sadhna has raised her hand.
I was thinking exactly that, which is that the concepts that you're describing have a ring of eternal truth to it. It has a ring of being so fundamental to the truth of what an ecosystem is. It has such a fundamental ring of what common basic decency might look like. That I was thinking it must need very little translation. You know, when you're dealing with other countries and their bases in Antarctica, it sort of touches on a common chord of just decency, logic, truth of nature. And then I thought, no, maybe that's maybe I'm being idealistic. So the question is, how has it translated? How has your work translated for others who are working in Antarctica, other bases? And I mean, clearly it makes so much sense on almost every level that it would be wonderful if it was taken up as a universal concept for how we deal in any new area in which we venture. But I'd like to hear from the real world how this is playing out.
Oh, that's a very good question. You know, I mean, every country runs their own base the way that they want to, but I guess for me as a researcher, when we share ideas with other researchers, we can see these ideas spreading. And that's really powerful. So I know I have an Australian colleague and with a PhD student who is about to do some work on Indigenous knowledge in Antarctica based from Australia. So I think that's going to be really exciting. And I think one of the great joys of being involved with the Antarctic Declaration for me is that it is about making visible people whose voices have not been well heard within the Antarctic Treaty System. But Billy, you know, Billy might want to talk about some of the other mechanisms by which we could take some of these ideas to a much broader global audience. I'm just thinking about you know, your work with the Arctic Council and other.
Oh yeah, I was wondering where you were going with
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Put me on the spot. Yeah, I guess like I was saying, you know, Antarctica is this very unique place. So an Indigenous voice in Antarctica is unprecedented. So if we're thinking, it'd be great to go, as you're trying to build one, to have some guidance from somewhere. And I think even then you're kind of limited in your choices of places to take lessons from. But you do have places like the Arctic, obviously very different to Antarctica. There's no real comparison, but you still can take lessons from the way Indigenous peoples have negotiated their permanent participant status on the Arctic Council. So that's a really great model to take lessons from. Like I said, the Murray-Darling Basin, you've got Indigenous peoples, you know, making great moves in terms of asserting their authority and voice in water policy and management across the Murray-Darling Basin, which is, you know, there's a long history there, a long settler colonial history, and these really key political strategies from Indigenous peoples to negotiate their voice. I think, yeah, there's lots of lessons we can take as Māori. You know, how do we partner with other Indigenous peoples to do this? You know, that's it's not going to happen overnight. It's a long process, and it needs to be done in a really considered way. Yeah, so
Thank you. We are getting very close to having to finish, but Al Patterson had actually asked a very similar question. You know, in what ways does Australia incorporate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges into Antarctica, and which we'd have to say they don't. And I think this is a marvellous example of what can happen. We've got a bunch of other comments there, but I'm probably not going to have time to go through them all. I am conscious, Sandro Antonello was, I believe, in this session, and he may still be there, but there is a very large Gondwana land project that operates out of University of New South Wales under the direction of Sandro and Alison Bashford, and they were telling me that there was an attempt at one point from some of the Indian researchers to have Antarctica designated as an Indian Indigenous site, because that is actually where the headways of the Ganges can be shown to be, because of the remnants of Gondwana land. So there's lots of ways in which people might think about the very deep history of Indigenous people's engagement with some landscapes that they may not have visited for a very long time.
And also just a shout out actually to the Indigenous peoples in South America, whose proximity to Antarctica and to their sailing as well. As I understand it, there are some archaeological or human remains on some of the Shetland Islands. I'm not quite sure of the detail, but I think there are many Indigenous peoples who are connected in different ways to Antarctica, and even people a long way away. This is this idea that we don't necessarily have to be close by or on site to actually have connection.
Look, that really does bring us to a close of this session. There was beautiful symmetry and synergies between this session and the previous session, which Ron Adams just pointed out to us, on stretching concepts, which was really quite lovely. So thank you very much, both of you, for your research, for the ways in which you presented it today, which was really illuminating. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a half-hour break and come back at 1 o'clock Melbourne time, which is half an hour from now. We're going to we'll have a little video that will be running during the break, and then we'll put up the slide as we did before. I hope you will come back at 1 o'clock, when we're going to hear from Matthew Spriggs, who's going to talk to us about Captain Cook in Vanuatu. So thank you so much. Scylla, Billy, it's been a real pleasure and a privilege to have heard from you this morning. So thank you.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Thank you.